Hello and welcome. I'm Claudia Rizzini, the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Eduardo Mercado III, our Grass Fellow. Whales have evolved for millions of years in an ecosystem that humanity still knows little about. Their use of sound extends beyond what our direct experience can reveal. Fascinated by Earth's largest composers, Eduardo's research is centered around the songs of humpback whales and how they are used in their day-to-day lives. As a behavioral neuroscientist with a background in cognitive science, Eduardo's interest is grounded in how brain plasticity contributes to learning, perception, and mental capacity in both animals and humans. His work with dolphins, who share several abilities with humans, despite their differing brain structures, further the field's understanding of their cognitive abilities. Eduardo has pioneered the hypothesis that whales use their song as a form of echolocation, disrupting the entrenched belief that song was used only as a mode of attracting mates. Sounds are critical in whales' ability to communicate, find food, and traverse the ocean waters. While at Radcliffe, Eduardo is working on a project that explores how environmental noise pollution and climate change impact whale songs and thus their ability to survive. He is also working to complete Why Whales Sing and Dolphins Don't, a scientific trade book that articulates his research for a general audience. Eduardo's work will not only provide insights on how best to protect whales from harm by using their songs as indicators of impending risk, but also shed light on the effects of human impacts on other marine life that rely on sounds for survival. And now, please join me in welcoming Eduardo Mercado.
Well, thank you, Claudia, for the introduction. And I also want to thank the Radcliffe Institute and all the staff there for making this year possible for me so that I could work on a variety of different projects, including this book project called Why Whales Sing and Dolphins Don't. I need to thank the fellows for being an inspiration to me throughout the year by their example, and especially the fellows who've been working with me in the writing group, which meets twice a week to try to force text through into the real world. And I'm happy to say that because of that group, I actually completed revising the last chapter of this book just this Monday. So I definitely owe them some thanks for that. So before I start to try to explain why I think whales sing, I just want to recognize Roger Payne, who passed away this last fall. He was a biologist who got his degree at Harvard. And in the early 70s, he was the first scientist to publish a publication suggesting that humpback whales sing in this classic science paper, which he published with Scott McVeigh. And that paper changed the way that not only scientists thought about whales and what they could do with sound, but also the general public's view of what whales were like, that they weren't just sort of sources of oil, for example. I also want to acknowledge another scientist who's not really recognized that often in the context of humpback whale song research, and that is the neuroscientist John Lilly. He didn't actually study humpback whales, but he began studying dolphins in the early 60s and was impressed with the complexity of their brain structure, which he thought might enable them to perform cognitive tasks comparable to what humans can perform, and even initiated investigations to look at whether it might be possible to communicate with dolphins and whether they were using their sounds for complex language like communication with each other. So he sort of set the conceptual stage in the early 60s for this idea that maybe whales and dolphins would be able to use sound in complex ways. And in addition to that, he also worked with Scott McVeigh, the co-author of the original paper, to try and process dolphin sounds, and that's the reason why Roger Payne recruited him. So he also set the methodological stage for this kind of complex analysis of sounds to try to understand their structure and how they could be used for communication. So both of these scientists not only were quite adept at discovering new features of animal behavior, but they also were very skilled at conveying this information to the general public. And as evidence of that, there's sort of two historical landmarks that you may know about, but if not, I'll tell you about them. So Roger Payne made an album of his recordings of humpback whales singing that actually wasn't a bestseller, probably the best-selling animal recording other than human music that exists. And as part of that, he worked together with National Geographic to create a plastic version that was embedded in their magazine that went out with all the individual copies. And so this plastic version of the songs of humpback whale was printed 10.5 million times, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, printing of any recording of any sounds that's happened so far. Well, I mean, now it's not going to happen because we have digital, but the other project that Roger Payne worked on with Carl Sagan was what's shown on the right here, the Golden Record, which was placed on the probe Voyager, which is still in contact more or less with the Earth. It's the farthest man-made object from Earth, now more than 24 billion kilometers away. And this Golden Record was created as essentially like a message to alien civilizations so they could hear the kinds of sounds that were occurring on Earth. And one of the prominent features of that were humpback whale song recordings. And so kind of the idea again was like maybe the aliens will hear something in these songs that we haven't heard, and so we should give them a chance to also communicate with other, intelligent civilizations. So speaking of recordings, you may have noticed there's some sounds that have been playing in the background, both when you first came in and when I first started talking. And I'm curious what people here think about those sounds, like what your impressions are or what it is that you're hearing. So this is the audience participation part of the talk. You can feel free to yell out or... So, someone says whales, that they're listening to whales, okay. Any other thoughts?
The sounds taper funny.
So they sound different, kind of like maybe not what you would normally encounter.
Sad? That sounds sad.
Sad, well, they probably are sad, but...
That sounds meditative.
Meditative, like maybe they're sort of like in a trance state. That's been suggested for some sounds like these. I mean, they're kind of calming, maybe. All right, no one mentioned music or singing. No one thinks that it's musical.
Well, sad music. It sounds musical. I mean, it sounds like my meditation app.
Yeah, people do use recordings of animal sounds to meditate. But I don't think anybody's using these animal sounds to meditate. Because what you're hearing are not whales. What you're hearing are these guys. They are bats, which you normally wouldn't hear, because when bats vocalize, their sounds are ultrasonic, meaning they're above the hearing range of humans. So they sound like silence to us, and for most of human history, no one knew they were making sounds. The only reason you can hear them right now is because I've slowed down recordings of bats vocalizing by a factor of 10, so that your slow brain can kind of follow what they're doing. And no scientist would describe these vocalizations as either musical or sad or, I don't know, mantric or anything like that, because this is echolocation. These are bats that are flying through the air, searching, using sound, and these are the sounds they make. I haven't altered the sounds. These are what they would sound like if you heard them. But because they're echolocating, the sounds themselves are not the important part for bats. It's the things that happen after the sounds, the echoes coming back. So this may raise the question of, why do echolocating bats sound like singers? Maybe even whales that are singing. And I'm illustrating here why is because when they're traveling through the world, they can't see anything, just like in this slide. They're facing darkness, and evolutionists sort of had to deal with this problem by coming up with other ways that they could sense the environment, and sound was the one that won. And so everything you're hearing right now is basically evolution's solution to what you do when you can't see. You create sounds that enable you to perceive the world, and these are the kind of sounds that nature came up with. So when bats are flying around, either in caves or when they're outside hunting for prey, they're producing sounds like this. They're much faster. And the sounds they're making are not to tell other bats that, hey, I'm looking for food. It's to get the echoes back from extremely tiny targets that are moving quite quickly. They can detect insects as small as gnats and mosquitoes using these kinds of sounds and then capture them on the fly. So it's extremely impressive what they've been able to do with sound. Okay, so this talk is not about bats, so you're probably wondering what's going on. Well, you can ask the exact same kind of question about why whales sound like singers. Why did the people describe them as singing in the first place? My answer to this question is for the exact same reason as bats. And I'm going to try to convince you of that a little bit in this talk. But if you ask any other, literally any other whale researcher than me, why it is that whales sound like singers, what they'll tell you is it's because whales are singing to display their sexiness, essentially. So that typically males doing it and females responding. So it's a kind of look how sexy I am when I make these sounds. And that's why they sound like singers, because they're trying to achieve reproductive success. I was curious what ChatGPT thought about this, or what answer. And this is the answer that ChatGPT gave to me when I asked it why whales sound like singers, which I found kind of interesting. And I want to home in especially on the last part of this, which is that, I'll just give the whole answer. So ChatGPT says, some whales sound like they're singing because they produce complex patterns of vocalizations. True. Possibly for communication and social interaction. That's the biologist Pat answer to this. ChatGPT also mentions navigation or other purposes, so being a little bit broader than the typical whale researcher would be. But then this part, which to human ears resemble melodic singing. And I think this is the key part of the whole thing. The reason why you hear these sounds as being sad or relaxing or musical is because your human brain has learned to process sounds that way. And so when you hear these sounds, you classify them as they're like these other sounds I've heard, which are music, and it's in your head, right? It's not in the sound itself. So this is why whales and bats sound like singers, is because you're imposing it on those sounds that they're making. All right. Now I'll try to tell you a bit more about why whales are singing from my perspective. The first thing you need to know to understand why whales are singing is that not all whales sing, or at least not all whales have been described as singing. And the four main species that have been studied the most in this context are blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, and bowhead whales. And when studies have been done of these species, they have looked to see what's happening when the whales are singing, and also what sex they are. And as I sort of alluded to before, a lot of these singers are males. As a matter of fact, most of the ones that have been sexed singing in behavioral studies are males. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use the word whales to refer to one of these, which is humpback whales, which is this guy. And that's partly for simplicity, but also partly because more is known about this singing whale than all the other whales combined. They've been studied the most from the very beginning. This is the one that Roger Payne described. So all of these whales are baleen whales, meaning that they don't have teeth and they filter feed, and it also means they're quite large, as sort of illustrated here. Impressively large, especially if you're in a small boat near one of them. When it comes out of the water or comes underneath your boat, then you're like, oh, they really are quite big. When they're singing, humpback whales, there's certain things you can predict that are likely to be the case. Number one, they're usually not moving very much. They're submerged, just hanging there. And they often hang in this position that's kind of like shown here with their head down. It's very predictable. They do sometimes sing while swimming. It's not uncommon, but it's not the typical. And in scientific studies, about, I would say, 75% of them are not moving at all. And also, importantly, they're usually alone. There might not be another whale within 15, 30 miles of them. Often you could just sit there, and there's just the one whale sitting there, not moving, singing. It's quite boring from a behavioral perspective because nothing's happening for hours. So this is important to keep in mind, that they're usually alone, they're usually not moving, they're always underwater when they're singing. Well, yeah. The other thing you should know is where they are when they're singing. So this is showing a map of, so they're migratory species. They travel back and forth from sort of the colder parts of the globe to the warmer parts every year. It's thousands of kilometers. It's impressive that they can do it at all. And they do it every year, most of them. And this globe is showing a bunch of different paths, but most of the ones you're seeing are humpback whales. All the orange paths are different groups of humpback whales. There's multiple separate populations, but they span the whole globe, essentially. And so because of that, they're traveling across lots of different environments, from the ice, studded scenery where it's quite cold, through deep ocean to shallow waters in Hawaii. They're covering all the ocean habitats at some point during this pathway. And singing has been recorded on every step of this path. For a long time, it was thought that they were only singing when they were in the tropics, because I guess most of the scientists wanted to go to the tropics to study them. And they do sing quite a bit there, but once they started recording the whole ocean, they discovered that, oh, wait, they're singing off the coast of Boston, things like that they didn't think were happening. And so in all the environments they sit in, they sing. And because they have such a wide habitat, they're much harder to study than, say, like a bird out in your yard or other land mammals. And so the techniques that are used to study them largely depend on simply recording them, usually when you can't see them. And today, there are many different techniques. It used to be the case that only Navy engineers could manage this with specialized equipment, but now you could easily buy your own equipment and record these guys, even off the coast of Boston. There are a huge variety of ways to do it, but they all come down to basically the same thing. You need an underwater microphone that can detect vibrations within the water, and you need some kind of storage device, usually digital, that will record the data that's being collected by the sensor. And so for all of my studies, they've basically been sort of the simplest of putting a hydrophone, that's the underwater microphone, off of a boat, or putting it on the ocean bottom and just recording continuously for long periods of time. And if you're too, ocean fearing to do that, you don't have to anymore, because there's huge databases available online that you can access, and I thought I'd just point this one because it has quite a lot of data. It's called Pattern Radio. It was developed by Google in cooperation with NOAA. They have it has thousands of hours of recordings made off the coast of Hawaii by a hydrophone that was there recording 24/7 for over a year. Actually, it's many years, but only a year's data is on this site. So I put the website at the bottom, and you can go to that site yourself and just scroll through and see piles of songs and what's happening. This is from 2015, this data set. So that's the kind of typical, you'll actually see the kind of data that most researchers are actually using. So I want to say a little bit about the song itself. When you record from these hydrophones, I mentioned you're collecting vibrations, and it's a relatively simple signal scientifically, which is illustrated here as a waveform. So the horizontal axis here is time, and the vertical axis is essentially sound level. So louder sounds make bigger spikes. I think it's pretty intuitive. And I also should mention that when whales are singing, they sing day and night. And I'm going to play you now a sample of an actual whale singing. And when you're hearing it, I want you to imagine that you're floating, you're not moving, you're weightless because you're underwater and you're neutrally buoyant. And you can't see anything because it's night, so you're basically in a brain in a vat is the closest thing to probably what it's like for a singing whale. One whale, probably by itself. Probably not moving. So when you hear this, you can hear that there's still this kind of rhythmic structure. There's sound, silence, sound, silence. You probably hear that the pitch is changing. Maybe you hear some patterns in the pitches that sound like they're being repeated. And that's sort of the typical thing you hear a singing whale do, especially humpback whales. But just listening to the sounds themselves and seeing this kind of data doesn't really give you a good sense of what's happening. You've heard 30 seconds of song, and their typical songs last about 15 to 20 minutes, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. And so you have to listen to this for the whole rest of the talk to hear one song and you probably would have forgotten what happened at the beginning by the time you get to the end. So scientists don't, in the modern day anyway, analyze the songs by listening to them or by looking at waveforms. They use another visual representation, which is shown here. These are called spectrograms. Again, the horizontal axis corresponds to time, but now there's also a vertical axis that corresponds to essentially pitch. So everywhere you see little bright dots correspond to sounds, and they're the strongest pitch that you would hear if you heard the sound. Now I'm showing you 35 minutes instead of 35 seconds. And even as a non-acoustician, if you look at this picture, you probably can detect that there are some patterns within these little dots they're changing over time, they're not constant. And also the patterns are repeating. So there's basically 6 patterns that are pretty similar occurring across time, across 35 minutes. And these patterns are what scientists call songs for whales. So it's the repeated cycling that's occurring. Interestingly, humpback whales, when they're singing, they don't take breaks. They actually sing even when they're surfacing, with the notes occurring when they're not breathing, kind of like a human singer might do. And so there's not really a beginning or end to the song. It's all just a continuous stream. And I'm showing you 35 minutes, but this is not the beginning or end of this whale's performance. These whales often sing like 8 hours, sometimes 20 hours. Fin whales have been recorded singing for 40 hours straight without stopping. It's crazy. And these guys are loud. I mean, maybe you thought it was loud in this room, but if you were in the water near one of these whales singing, your bones would be literally vibrating. And you're probably like, why am I doing this right now? If you're in a boat over a whale that's singing, it actually makes your boat vibrate, so you can feel in your feet the sound. That's how intense they are. The sounds can travel for like 10, 15 kilometers, sometimes 100 kilometers, and still be audible. That's not the loudest of the singing whales, but it's still quite impressive. So the second thing you need to know about singing whales is that they are vocal gods, because if a human tried to do this for 20 hours straight, even at half the volume of what a whale's doing, their vocal memories would just implode probably. And not only that, but humpback whales in particular have a vocal range that extends beyond all humans. So they can produce sounds that are lower than the lowest sound that any human can vocalize, and they can produce sounds higher than the highest professional soprano, which is even more insane given how large they are. And they do it for like hours and hours. I mean, even a professional soprano cannot hit those high notes for like, 100 times per day, every day. It's not going to happen. So they're really quite impressive. I did not know this when I first started studying humpback whales about 30 years ago when I was in grad school. My impression of them initially was that they're probably like ocean cows that swim around and collect, plankton, which is the equivalent of grass, and they probably moo a lot. That's kind of what I thought about them. It was only when I actually started analyzing them myself that I started seeing things that seemed like surprising to me. And the more I looked at them, the more confused and surprised I became. And at some point, I came up with this crazy hypothesis that maybe what they're doing is not just talking to each other or even to females or displaying like a peacock. Maybe what they're doing is more like sonar. Oh, and by the way, I should mention, all of these illustrations that I'm showing here were created for the book by an artist named Emily Ang, who's quite talented. And I'm extremely lucky that she's helping on this project. So I should have mentioned that earlier when I started showing the drawings. So the kind of sonar that I was envisioning is something similar to what the US Navy uses to detect submarines. So very long-range sonar that can detect very submarine-sized targets from distances of more than a mile. And in this context, although you might think of humpback whales as being quite large, if they're 5 miles away from you, they're not so large anymore. They're sort of like, if you could see them, which you can't in the water, they would be quite tiny, almost like a gnat is to a bat. And so because of this, I thought that probably their signals might be more like what a bat would use with these very tiny targets, except for that the sounds are going much farther than what the bats are doing. They're underwater, which introduces some complexities. And also, they're not trying to catch the other whales in their mouth. So that's a kind of a big difference in terms of the actual behaviors you might see when these whales are doing this. And so when I initially had this idea, I was like, that's insane. There's no way that's possible. And so then I started trying to figure out why it wasn't possible, and I couldn't figure it out. And I was sort of like doubting my scientific, why I should even be in grad school. It's like, this should be straightforward and obvious. I just have to, it's just basic physics. I should understand that, but I did not. And so I ultimately resorted to sending emails to two experts, one who was a famous dolphin sonar researcher and another who was a famous ocean acoustician. And surprisingly, they both replied to my email. And basically what I asked was like, this should be impossible, right? This can't be happening. And the dolphin sonar, they both wrote me back. The dolphin sonar experts said, yeah, it's impossible. That's not happening. And the physicist wrote back and said, oh yeah, that's definitely possible, and it's definitely happening. And I was like, okay, well, at least I know why I'm confused now, because it's confusing. But it at least gave me some reason to keep, if they both said, I would have been done. That might have been better, actually. But, so I was like, okay, well, maybe it's possible, and I would talk to the physicist and the sonar guy, and I tried to work out all the things that would have to be looked at, like the behavior. The behavior actually was pretty consistent with being able to detect echoes from that distance. So I did like a whole year of analysis, and I developed a talk to describe my results, and I decided to present at a scientific conference. And this is where I discovered that science is not all about telling the things you found and then having people like test your ideas or whatever, because when I presented this at this conference, what I got was extreme rage. Literally, after I finished my talk, they asked if there were any questions, and a quite famous whale researcher stood up and just started screaming at me, literally. There was no question in it, by the way. And this is a quote from one of the things he said when he was sort of yelling at me at the end of my talk, was that you're ignoring 50 years of ecological and behavioral research, which is scientific speak for you're an idiot. And so at that point, my advisor, he got like shell-shocked from the whole thing, and he disavowed the whole project. He said, I don't have anything to do with this. And forever after, he was not, none of his name never appeared in anything I did. I was still a grad student. I'm like, this is not good. And so I pivoted and started studying more basic features of humpback whale acoustic behavior that were not so loaded. Things like production of the sounds, like how physiologically does a whale make the sounds? Clearly they're making sounds. How do they do it? I was trying to understand the specifics of how that worked, and also especially how the sounds propagated once they were produced in the water, because underwater sound transmission is quite complex because of the surface and the bottom. It requires pretty sophisticated models to predict what's happening, especially when you're near a landmass like, say, Hawaii, and you're in shallow water. It's very complex what happens, and it depends on the features of the sounds, and so I did a lot of analyses and simulations of that, all basically ocean physics, which was, I learned a lot from that. And then I also looked at the other end of the reception process. So presumably the whales are making sounds because they want a whale to hear them, whether it's themselves or some other whale. And so I was looking at how sound entered the whale's head, because it's quite different from a land mammal where the air goes around your head and into these little holes in the side. In the case of whales, the sound goes directly from the water into the whale's body, so it's coming in from all directions at the same time. And the skeleton and the skull and sort of oil all are shaping the sound as it comes in, kind of like their whole body is like their outer ear. And so that's quite interesting. And there's lots of things you can study there, and it's still not understood exactly how they do it. But the kind of most surprising thing happened while I was still in grad school. This paper came out by a neuroanatomist who had analyzed the number of neurons that were actually connected to the ears of whales and dolphins and was comparing them to other species, and that's this table shown to the right. So humans are quite good at hearing, and they're one of the best mammals, land mammals, in terms of resolution and things like that. We have about 30,000 neurons connected to each of our ears, and that, if you look at along, it's a pretty small membrane, so that ends up being about 1,000 neurons per millimeter, which is pretty dense for a sensory reception system. However, not so impressive once you compare it to echolocating species like bats and dolphins. So bats have less neurons than humans connected to their ears, but they're way more dense, like twice the density of what you see in humans. Dolphins are even more impressive. They have 3 times the number of neurons, even more densely innervating their ear than a human is. And the sort of new evidence that was here, which is the part where I saw, I was like, that is impressive. Humpback whales have 5 times the neurons per ear as a human. I mean, they're bigger, so you could say, they get 5 times everything, probably, from a human. But in addition to that, they're also more densely innervated, so more than twice as many neurons per millimeter that a human has. So this is kind of the third thing you need to know about seeing humpback whales, is that they have extremely impressive auditory sensitivity at the receptor level. Just incoming sounds alone, they have resolution as high as what a bat or a dolphin has, and exactly what you would expect to see in an animal that echolocates. So these things just sort of like convinced me. I was like, it wasn't such a dumb idea after all. This was a prediction. This neuroanatomist had no idea. She wasn't at that meeting, luckily. And so I was like, okay, so they definitely can hear extremely high resolution, much higher than people are thinking they can. Now, most whale researchers have not really focused a lot on this aspect of singing, and partly and they're skeptical. I mean, they're all skeptical of the idea that song could be used for sonar, and part of the reason why are headlines like these or findings like these. And this just came out last year. This idea that humpback whales are passing their songs across oceans. It's been described as cultural evolution or cultural revolutions in some cases. And the idea is that if you record whales in a given area, what the songs they're producing, they gradually change over time, sometimes really quite rapidly change over time, such that in different years you'll have different songs, and you can't really predict what you're going to hear. Now, the interesting thing about this, or one of the interesting things, is that when you record whales, like say in Hawaii this year, pretty much every whale you record will produce the same pattern, not the one I just showed you because that's an older pattern, but whatever pattern they produce, they'll all be doing kind of the same thing. So that means they're all changing communally. They're all modifying their songs over time, and they're all changing the same way. And so that's led scientists to believe that maybe whales are something like pop musicians, that in 2015 there's a certain song that they all really are like, this is the best song we could sing, and they all kind of sing that. And then as the years go by, the trends change and there's fashions, and females are like, that was cool last year, but and so like, oh, well, listen to this new sexy song, you'll like this one, and then they kind of keep on progressing over and over like that. So this kind of phenomenon is quite impressive for many reasons. It is problematic for the idea that whales are using songs for echolocation, because no other species that echolocates is changing their songs in this way. And it was troubling to me for a long time, and one of the biggest sort of things I didn't understand what could be happening. In the last 10 years, I have done research that shows that the way they're changing these sounds actually preserve all of the echoic features that would enable them to use them as sonar. So I feel a little more confident now. But actually, it doesn't really matter whether the whales are changing their songs because they're like trying to stay in the trendy side of singing, or they're changing their songs for some complex reasons related to echolocation. Because regardless of why they're doing it, they are the only mammals other than humans that do it. Actually, the only other animals other than humans that do it. There are birds that modify. Most mammals, once they become adults, they just lock into a certain set of sounds and they keep on using it. That's also true for birds. There are some mammals and some birds that will modify or add to their sounds they make as adults, but there's none that continuously change entire sound sequences every year to produce new sounds. That's us, humpbacks, and that's it. So that suggests there's something very special going on with them, and it's going to be very special no matter what they're doing with it. And so I became really interested in this because when an animal is changing the kind of basic sounds it's using throughout its life, that implies that it's learning throughout its life. And to be able to learn and use the sounds, like if you learn a new language when you're 35, you're hearing totally new combinations possibly, that requires that your brain has to modify itself to deal with these new incoming sounds. And so for this to happen requires extreme plasticity to occur within an animal's brain. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the talk that John Lilly studied the brains of dolphins and showed that they were quite complex and thought that was a sign that they were quite intelligent. He had never seen the brain of a humpback whale, but I can tell you they're just as complex as a dolphin's brain. They're actually a little bigger than a dolphin's brain, so they have all the hardware available that a dolphin would have. It's quite difficult to study a large whale's brain. There are very few studies of them. However, because there are commonalities between a whale's brain, a dolphin's brain, a human's brain, and other brains of mammals, studies of neuroscience and other species can give you some sense about what's happening, especially in echolocating bats. There's a lot of research. And from that, you can tell that there are some complex processes that occur within bats that are likely happening in whales, and you can kind of get a sense about what has to change, how does the system have to work to be able to enable these whales to process sounds and continuously deal with all these modifications and the complexity that they're sort of faced with. So I'm quite interested in brain plasticity, as I mentioned in the introduction, and this is how I became interested in it, which is not the most direct route, but definitely relevant to understanding what humpback whales are doing when they sing. So I've thrown a lot of details at you, and just to sort of kind of give you a big picture overview. So why are whales singing? There's two stories I've told. One is the biologist story, which is basically singers or serenaders. They're mostly males or all males. They're singing to show off their acoustic peacock tails to the females to try to convince them that they're the best. They're the ones that should be chosen to be mated with. Maybe they're trying to attract females. Some would suggest they're innovating. That's where the new songs are coming from. Maybe other whales are copying the popular whale that's getting all the ladies, so they have a better chance of getting some themselves. But it's all about seduction, and that's the standard biological model. So if you tell your kids for their science classes, tell them this, because that's what we kind of write in the answer. And then there's my version, which is not actually, doesn't rule out this first story, but it definitely adds on to it. And that's that singers could be viewed as sentinels, that what they're doing is they're searching through their environment. They're trying to perceive what's happening around them because they can't see. They're in total darkness most of the time, and even when they're not, the ocean is not that transparent over 2 miles. So they're echolocating, they're tracking targets, and they're trying to interpret what's happening, because when they see another animal 3 miles away, they can't just swim there, because by the time they get there, it takes like 20 minutes. The other whale's like 20 minutes somewhere else. So they have to interpret what's happening and say, okay, here's the scene. Which of these guys are females? Which of them will I be able to reach before they're gone? And what's my strategy here? So it actually involves a pretty complex kind of mental process to be able to kind of essentially form the world in your head and then figure out what to do based on what you're perceiving in real time to plan, like, maybe hours ahead of what's going to happen. So they're scanning and they're trying to understand and react to that. Now, it could be both of these things. It could be one or the other. I'm not going to try to make you choose one. And some of you may be thinking, like, well, who cares? Like, they're making fancy sounds, and maybe they're doing it for the fun of it. And what difference does it make to me? I'm not a whale. Well, that would be all fine and good if humans and humpback whales and other singing whales were kind of independent universes, but we're not. Humans are having massive effects on whales, and the kind of biggest example of this is from the whaling years. So this is showing a graph where it starts off back in the good old days before humans got fancy in the ocean, and when whales were all swimming around singing and minding their own business, until some humans like, oh, we can make some lights using whale oil. And then they're just like, let's go get the oil. And so they start doing that, and then the whales are like, oh, that's not good. And then, of course, they get wiped out. So they go from tens of thousands to like less than 1,000 in like less than a decade. And this is humpback whales in one area, but this is true for many whales. And then that's it. They're just kind of like down there, barely surviving for like 30 or 40 years. And then eventually people are like, maybe we shouldn't be killing all of them. And once that it took a while for that to catch on, and Roger Payne actually helped with that. Then people said, okay, there is some value to having the whales alive. And luckily for these guys, it wasn't true for all the whales, as you may know. Once people stopped sort of killing them left and right, they started recovering. And so that's like, good. We've corrected our ways, and now we're going to let the whales be what whales should be in the ocean. And that sounds like a success story, except for that now we're almost maybe moving back towards the original sort of like, oh, let's do blah, 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 and then if we kill a bunch of animals, then I guess that's going to be bad. But and in this case, though, it's a little more subtle, because we're doing it not as a way to get anything from the whales, we're just doing it to get things for ourselves. And so what this map is showing are shipping lanes for cargo ships across the globe. Wherever you see brighter colors like red is where more shipping traffic is happening. And if you remember the previous slide, you may recognize that a lot of these paths are crossing over where whales are at. Now, obviously there's some risk that the ships themselves are giant, might hit these whales, and that does happen quite a bit. But that's not the only factor that can affect their lives, because these ships are extremely loud. So this data is from pattern radio. And on the left side here, I'm showing a whale singing kind of in a more pristine environment. And then ships start coming through, and that's what's shown on the right side of the screen. And when you see a lot of white, that means there's a lot of sound. And if you can go see this yourself, this happens every day in Hawaii for many hours. And once the sounds start coming, the whale has to deal with that. So if the whales are just singing to be sexy, maybe they can just get a little bit closer to the female, and the female will be like, okay, fine, you're still sexy, you're just right in front of me. That would be okay, maybe. But if they're using these faint echoes to tell where the females are at, and you start throwing this sound on top of that, then they're screwed, because basically you've made them blind. They can't tell where anything's at. They're not going to ever find the female in the first place, much less be able to try to convince them to have sex with them. And so now you basically said, okay, you're not going to breed anymore. So congratulations, I guess. I don't. And so in this context, I would say maybe what's happening is that we've sort of inadvertently created a new sort of nouveau whaling, or a new way of taking out whales by ordering things on Amazon, which, kind of like when they were using whale oil for lamps, people didn't think like, oh, I can see now because I'm killing a whale. And you probably wouldn't think, oh, I can get the newest computer because I'm killing a bunch of whales. Why would you think that? So I do think that it's relevant to understand what's happening when whales sing, because we could be having major effects on their behavior and not realize it's too late. And maybe they can survive, come back again, but maybe not. Maybe we got lucky the last time. All right, I don't want to end on that dismal note of the kind of potential future whale fate. So I wanted to end with this birth announcement, which is that during my time at Radcliffe, I also worked on a proposal for a second book, which I'm calling Leviathan Mind. And this book is very close to being under contract. As a matter of fact, it might be this week. And also, I just would say that, if Radcliffe is willing to give me a second year of funding, along with all the members of the writing group, then I'm pretty sure we could have this baby born by this time next year. So that's just a thought to throw out there. Let me close by thanking all the groups that have helped me to do research over the last 20 years, and thank you for listening to my talk about whales.
Wow, fascinating. Really good. Thank you. There are a few questions. Let's see. The first question asks whether during your research you've spoken with audiologists or recording audio engineers, which I assume you did, regarding constructed sounds. If so, what were their responses? What information did you gain from them? How did the collaboration go?
So I do interact with audiologists. There's a big group at the University of Buffalo where I do my research. And most of them don't think about whales. They think about humans, not surprisingly. But they are surprised at the level of innervation in the whale's ear. They're surprised at the range of sounds that whales are using. I think they're surprised. It's hard for them to think about the way whales use sound, in part because they're not used to thinking about sound in water. And they're also not thinking about sound, the echoes as being the main signal versus, say, the direct thing like speech would be. Mm-hmm. So I definitely learned a lot about processing audio signals from audiologists.
Okay. So the next question is, are the songs that other species of whales sing basically the same as those that humpback whales sing? Or does each species have its own unique song? I guess it's the latter, but can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. So I mentioned 4 species. You can kind of split those 4 into 2 groups. The largest ones, the fin whales and the blue whales, produce songs that are probably more similar to what you heard when I was playing bats earlier. They're much simpler than humpback whale songs. They don't change as much as humpback whale songs over time, although they do change. They're quite repetitive. They're louder. So they have many features in common with humpback whale song, but they are much simpler. Now, the bowhead whale is a whole different story. They do produce complex songs, in some ways more complex than humpbacks in terms of variety, but they're not showing the same kinds of changes across years, gradual changes across years that you see in humpback whales. So in general, the whales all have sort of a common rhythmic, repetitive, monotonous sort of structure when they produce their songs, but they do definitely have sort of unique features that would distinguish them. Probably similar to like bird song variations, but maybe even more similar than what you see in birds.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to dolphins. So the title of your book is Why Whales Sing and Dolphins Don't, but you didn't say why dolphins don't.
Right.
Why don't they?
So I guess there's probably some controversy about even saying that, well, I guess it depends who you ask. So any whale researcher would say that dolphins don't sing, and they would say that the reason why is because song refers to a very complex repeated pattern. But as I just mentioned, blue and fin whales' songs are not that complicated, so it's not just that. And so part of the reason why the scientists say that dolphins don't sing is because they don't see them using it in a context where they think it's a reproductive display. So they've treated songs and reproductive displays as being the same thing. But if you use sort of the classic definition of an animal song, it only suggests that they have to use sequences of sound and repeat them in sort of patterns. And dolphins definitely do that, especially orcas. So it's interesting to kind of read the literature to see like what people, the kind of terms they use to describe things like orcas producing these repeated patterns, because orcas do produce patterns that are very similar to ones that singing whales produce. And they do things like say they're producing repeated sound patterns or regularly repeated sound sequences, but they never call it singing. So I would say that dolphins, my title doesn't say it, but I actually claim in the book that dolphins do sing, but people just don't want to call it that because of sort of past historical reasons. Mm-hmm. I will say that dolphins, when they echolocate, typically they use things that are very simple, clicks, and they don't have the song-like properties. Mm.
Let's go back to whales. Do whales sing differently in more or less complex physical environments? And what about differences in social environments? So, yeah, physical environments.
Yeah, so this is actually an interesting question that I've been trying to figure out for a while. So I mentioned that whales sing in a variety of different environments, including deep water, shallow water. And my initial thought was they probably would modify their sounds based on the environment. Bats do that in many cases. But it's tricky to tell because they're changing their sounds a lot in general. There is some evidence that the songs they produced when they're in the polar regions differ systematically from the ones they produce when they're in the tropical regions. That could be because of the environmental conditions, but it hasn't been established yet. And the same thing with context. So part of the reason why, so there's this question of why males are always the ones singing, and I believe that's a context-dependent factor. So the males are the main ones that are trying to locate the females. The females do not seek out males during any time of the year. So definitely the songs they're producing are based on whether they're trying to mate or whether they're trying to feed. They do sometimes sing when feeding. It's not clear yet if the songs they produce then are different or not, because no one's actually looked to see. So they definitely do vary their song in different situations, but it's not clear what's driving them to vary it.
Mm-hmm. So you really surprised us with the numbers of the number of hours that whales can sing. And so there is a question about the energetic cost of singing for whales. For example, does it burn a lot of calories and requires them to find more food? And following on from that, will scarcer food resources due to climate change affect singing? And does their ability to sing or hear echo sounds wear out as they age? So there is a question about energy, food, and the aging.
Right. So yeah, there's a lot of things there. So first off, I mentioned that whales migrate from the sort of polar regions to more tropical regions, and partly that's because of feeding constraints. So sort of amazingly, they're really only eating a lot when they're in the polar regions. So they eat for like multiple months. And then once they start swimming these thousands of miles, they stop eating. And so they may not eat for like several months, anything. And they're singing all that time. So they're just living off of their blubber reserves, and they're kind of going down, 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 using it as a resource. I don't even know how they can swim that far and swim back without ever eating, much less do things like sing. And they also compete physically for females. So of all the things they do, I feel like singing is the least energetic one of them. And the fact that they can sing without resting for 20 hours suggests also that it's not very tiring for them. They've somehow figured out some way of balancing the energetics so that they can kind of maintain a state, probably a flow state, for long periods without using up a lot of energy. The second issue about whether climate might affect singing through feeding, that's actually possible because the changes in temperature in the ocean are definitely changing the distribution of prey that different baleen whales eat, so that can change where they swim. There's some signs that they're not going to places that they normally would go to when they migrate, so that could affect how they sing because they're in different locations. And it may also affect the amount of the time they spend feeding versus doing things like trying to socially interact, which is when singing might be most relevant. So definitely I would say that all the things that have been discovered about singing patterns so far could change quite a bit as the whales start moving around to different places.
Yeah. So here's another question. So sperm whales use clicks for hunting-related echolocation and also to stun squid prey. Are there any similarities between humpback and sperm whales' vocalization? And does phylogeny provide any evolutionary clues about the evolution of humpback song vocalization out of echolocation?
Okay, so the first issue, so sperm whales use clicks to echolocate, as was mentioned, but they also use clicks to communicate. They produce patterns that are called codas, which if they weren't sperm whales would probably be called songs, but because they are not baleen whales, no one calls them songs. So they use clicks for both things. And humpback whales also produce clicks when they're singing and also when they're trying to catch prey. So there's some indications that humpback whales also use clicks in a variety of ways that may map onto some of the ways that sperm whales use them. Now, sperm whales' clicks are higher in frequency, pitch than the clicks that humpback whales make. So there's definitely differences in what they could be used for in terms of detecting things and how far away they would work. But I do think that the fact that they're both using clicks and they're both using them in somewhat similar contexts probably suggests that they've evolved for similar reasons. I'm sorry, I forgot the second part was about...
the phylogeny, does phylogeny provide any evolutionary clues
right,
about,
yes.
Is that, okay.
Okay, so the evolution of song, so humpback whales have been evolving for 10 million years or more. It's not clear how evolution evolved in the initial stages before baleen whales and toothed whales split. Some people think that it didn't evolve until they split, and some people think there was a precursor to it. So a lot of that's lost. There's not species that are kind of intermediate that would tell us what was the initial state. But you can look at bats to see the range in bats, and there's a lot of variety in terms of the way the bats are using sound. And I think that's probably the best clue as to what happened with the humpback whales and the sperm whales in terms of basically selecting different habitats and specializing for those specific needs.
Yeah. So you mentioned that songs travel long distances. Is there any evidence that singers that are far apart ever sing together in an ensemble?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So initially there was a lot of work looking at singers, especially humpback whales, to see if they were singing in choruses where they were kind of combining their efforts. There's been a lot of interest especially in blue whales whose songs can go across the entire ocean about whether they might be doing things according to their songs. But for the most part, people have not found evidence that there's clear coordination between individuals that are sort of co-singing or duetting or things like that. Actually, at Radcliffe, this is one of the projects that I've been working on with the RRPs and also in collaboration with some researchers at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, trying to look at more detailed features of what whales do when they're co-singing at distances of maybe 2 or 3 miles. And there, I guess this is news that's not published yet, there is some evidence that we found that they're not duetting in the sense of singing to match each other, but they are I would say there's a very good chance that they're interacting in real time while they're singing when they can hear each other.
Next question. So is there a relationship between the singing and whale aggression?
Interestingly, so there have been studies of whales singing and which whales will come up to them. And initially it was thought they attracted females, but all the studies that have been done, including playback studies, have found that when a silent whale approaches a singer, it's almost always a male. And you might expect that there would be some competition at that point. I should have mentioned that whales don't have stable social groups like dolphins. They tend to be nomads their entire lives, so they don't really have friends or partners or things like that. So you might imagine 2 strange whales come together, there's going to be some agonism between them, but actually that's not what's found. It's very rare for the male that joins a singer to actually do anything agonistic or aggressive, and the same thing for the singer. The most common outcome is the singer will stop, they kind of sit there for 5 minutes, and then the one that came swims away. So there's very little aggression between them. However, when they're competing for females, they're usually not singing. So this is whales that are in a group that are around a female. And they're pretty intense. They definitely are like creating injuries. There's blood flying. There have been whales killed in these competitions. So, I mean, these guys are big. If one of them hits you, you're going to know it. And they're definitely aggressive in that context. So you could say singing is the peaceful period, and the actual aggression occurs when they're really close to the female.
Mm-hmm. Carry on aggression. You talked earlier about the fact that there are accidents happening between ships and whales. And we may be stretching here, but are whales combating ship sounds interference? Might shifting trends in whale songs be adaptation to intrusion in the sonic environment?
There have been some studies looking at whales singing in areas where there's a lot of noise to see if they adjust what they're doing when the ship noise is there. The most common adjustment is just to stop. But there's very little evidence that they actually try to sing louder. They're probably as loud as they can do it already. And they don't seem to kind of like try to acoustically avoid the sounds the ships are making, which they couldn't do if they wanted to. Mm-hmm. So I don't think they're actively trying to like avoid the sounds of the ships. And I definitely think that the shifting part was happening before ships ever existed, probably for millions of years. So I think that's part of their natural behavior for whatever advantage it gives them. Mm-hmm. The only defense I really can see for them when something like a cargo ship comes by is to leave, or just never be where the ships are at in the first place, which they don't have maybe don't have as many choices about given their habitat.
Yeah. Let's get to your book. Does your book touch on your personal journey and your interest, obviously, in whales and sounds, and also the pushback that you received in academy, and explaining the journey, but also the difficulties that you've...
Yeah, so the book does sort of lay out things that I couldn't say when I was a grad student, and now that I guess I can say more so, that I have tenure. And so I thought it would be useful for people to know why it is that I'm the only one saying this. So partly the politics of like why people are very locked into their current ideas about what's happening, but also just sort of like what that means in terms of trying to publish papers, for example. Like what happens when you submit a paper and all the reviewers say you're crazy? What happens is the paper doesn't get published. And so how do you deal with that? Other ways to get around it. And so I do have throughout the book sort of discussions of sort of challenges with funding and challenges with publishing and sort of interactions with other more prominent researchers and ways that I've tried to deal with it or ways that others have sort of responded to it. So I think in that sense it talks about my personal journey, but more in the context of like, here's what you're gonna have to deal with if you ever say an idea that doesn't match what everybody already believes in science.
Yeah. And one final question. So if you had unlimited funding to spend testing your idea that singing whales are echolocating, how would you use it?
Yeah, well, that would be pretty nice. So if there's anybody with like some extra cash they want to get rid of, definitely. So here's what I would do. They would be mostly playback studies, which are tricky in of itself because you have to get permission from the government to do them, but I've done it before, so I probably could do it again. There are experiments with dolphins where you can record a dolphin's sounds as they come out, process them with a computer, and then broadcast them back to them in the form of what's called a phantom echo. So it's like a virtual reality for dolphins. You create the echoes from the targets and send them to them, and then you see if the dolphin can tell them apart or tell what's happening. And you can do the same thing in the wild with whales using radio transmitters. So you record the whale as they're singing, you generate a phantom target, another whale, and you see what happens. And my prediction is that if the whale is doing things that the singer is interested in, that singer will go to where the non-existent whale is at. The other thing you can do with that same system is actually interact as if you're another singer. So if you want to see if the singer is modifying their song based on what other singer is doing, you could become a singer and in real time modify the sounds that you're making to kind of essentially goad the singer to say, okay, I'm here now, what are we going to do about it? And get a better sense about how much control they have over the sounds they're making. So you could be either a silent whale or a vocal whale, and then you could actually test all kinds of hypotheses about what should happen in that context.
Yeah, wow. Good luck.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Eddie, for the presentation. It's spectacular, and for answering all our questions. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. I hope you'll be able to join us for our Radcliffe events. You can find videos of past events and information about new events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of the day.